Introducing Scott Ritter's YouTube channel, a platform dedicated to discussing the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. Scott Ritter, an expert in international relations, provides in-depth analysis and commentary on the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine. With his extensive knowledge and first-hand experience, Scott Ritter offers unique insights into the historical background, geopolitical complexities, and humanitarian aspects of the conflict. Join his channel to gain a comprehensive understanding of the crisis, including its impact on regional stability and global politics. Through well-researched and balanced content, Scott Ritter's YouTube channel serves as a valuable resource for anyone interested in delving deeper into the Russian-Ukrainian war.
Our next question comes from Mars, and we're not going to say exactly who on Mars, but somebody. Will Russia need to perform a general mobilization in order to win this operation or push to Dnipro River? Or is their general strategy to hold the line until the 2024 USA election and hoping that a different president may change U.S. policy?
You know, the Russians have been, they have not put a timeline on anything, and that's frustrating for outside observers like myself, because we're always asked questions like this about timelines. And normally, when you're going to answer a question, you seek guidance from statements. You know, you'd like a politician to say, it's our goal to have this thing wrapped up by this date. Russians aren't prisoners to the calendar. The Russians are basically, you know, goal driven. And their goal is the destruction of the Ukrainian military and denazification of the Ukrainian government. They're achieving the destruction of the Ukrainian military. How they're going to achieve denazification is still unknown. You know, but I think if I'm a Russian military planner, and I'm not, and I don't call them and I don't interact with them, but I think I understand how they think. I'm looking at a situation where it just took NATO 8 months to build up this 12 brigade core size, 60,000 man Leopard tank, Bradley fighting vehicle equipped force to carry out this counteroffensive. And there's not a similar buildup taking place now, meaning that once this 60,000 strong force is eradicated, there's nothing to replace it. Now, that's when you want to put the maximum pressure on the Ukrainians, when the enemy is at its weakest. So it makes no sense to sit there and grind the Ukrainian military down to nothing and then wait for what, November 2024, give NATO another year and a half to rebuild it, so you have to do this all over again. I think the Russians are best served by taking advantage of the situation that presents itself. And right now, the situation appears to be that the Ukrainian military will be strategically defeated by the autumn of this year, by end of summer, early fall of this year. And at that point in time, you know, the Russians will then take advantage of this military victory to pursue their political ends. What that looks like is unknown. I had an interesting conversation with the guy the other week where he said, you know, there's more and more people in Moscow thinking that the best way to denazify Ukraine isn't forcefully, but through democracy. And what I mean by that is Ukrainians have elections in March of 2024, and that you know, a lot of problems would be solved for Russia if the Zelensky government was voted out and a government willing to work with the Russians was voted in. That you know, gets Russia moving in the right trajectory in terms of political reform without compelling Russia to commit military resources to make that happen, understanding that if you try to militarily remove Zelensky, that you increase greater political resistance among the population, because it is always the trend of a population to push back against an occupier. But if Russia is successful in defining this conflict as Russia merely trying to assert control over the Russian portions of Ukraine that have been absorbed by Russia, which everybody with the brain on their shoulder understands. These territories were always leaning towards Russia. If the Ukrainian people could say, okay, we're willing to accept this new reality, as long as the rest of us are intact, and we recognize that NATO is a death trap. We just saw what happened here. We'll elect somebody in office who will make the changes necessary, the basically outlawing the Banderist ideology, et cetera, work with Russia, and it solves a lot of headaches. So I think if Russia can militarily defeat Ukraine and then create the conditions to help shape the political development of Ukraine so that in March 2024, Zelensky is removed, somebody else is put in, that might be the solution. But the bigger pause between Russian military victory and a political solution, you create more opportunity for NATO to continue to pour in equipment, and basically the cycle begins anew.
All right, let's do one more question of the ones that were submitted in advance, and then we can take some live questions coming in on Facebook and YouTube, including the very persistent Sparky and his co-conspirator Ann, who've been haranguing Scott with a particular question. We'll try to get to that. Atef from Tunis, Tunisia. Why is Europe letting itself down the path of destruction to allow the USA to stay in the game for a few more years?
Because Europe doesn't know anything else. Europe is incapable of conceiving a geopolitical reality that has Europe thriving without the United States. They've allowed themselves to be taken over by the United States economically and politically in terms of the elites and the affiliation of the elites. So, and the other thing is the European Union. The history hasn't been written on this yet, but I think history will show that the European Union, rather than creating a unified Europe, destroyed Europe, literally destroyed Europe. Europe is not the United States. It's not a melting pot of nations. Europe has distinct nations with distinct cultures, histories, languages, religious differences that when you combine them, they create, for instance, Germany. What is Germany? What is France? We know that France is not Germany. They're two totally different countries. We know that about Italy as well. But with the European Union and the way that they're struck, the idea was to take down the borders, create this cross-filtration. And the end result is that you dilute the national essence of the nation to the point that the Germans today identify as Germans from a nationalistic standpoint. And the answer more and more is no. The same thing with the French. Are people willing to defend their countries anymore? What is their country when you deal with this European Union nonsense? Europe is fundamentally weakened itself. I mean, how else can you explain what's happened after Nord Stream? I mean, normally one would expect when a $12 billion piece of critical energy infrastructure that helps define the trajectory of your economy gets blown up, that the people of that nation would be outraged, be on their feet. But what we see in Germany is silence, because Germany has been largely neutered as a nation. What is the German nation? The same thing with the French. Although the French, I have to tell you, have shown a little bit more gumption, in responding to Macron's decision to raise the retirement age. There's some there's some stuff going on in France, and we see that in the Netherlands too. The farmers are standing up, but the policies that have been embraced by many of these European countries are just ridiculous policies that make no sense from a standpoint of looking out for your national interest, because nobody talks about the national interest anymore. They talk about the European interest, but there is no European interest because there is no Europe. There is no unified entity called Europe. They're trying to make it that way, but it doesn't exist. We already know that there's a fracture between old Europe and new Europe. We know that there's a fundamental disconnect between the the nations that defined Europe during the Cold War and the European structure today, where they've incorporated these former Soviet bloc nations, that they don't unify very well. They don't work with each other. And even within themselves, we're seeing nations start to break away. Hungary with Viktor Orban. There's movements in Austria that are designed to maybe redefine, Austria's role and what Austria believes in. And elsewhere, I think we're going to see Europe, go through a period of fragmentation. And what I mean by that is fragmentation in opposition to the concept of a European Union. But that's how we got to where we are right now. Because, again, let's just take a look at Germany. I mean, this is something that was brought up to my attention, and I've done a little bit of research. I haven't completed it, but the role played by BlackRock, for instance, of foreign investors in taking control of German companies, so that the companies no longer respond to the needs of Germany, but respond to the needs of a multinational board of directors, to multinational stockholders, which means that decisions are going to be made that aren't beneficial to Germany, but beneficial to that country. You can't speak of a German industrial base when the industrial base doesn't respond to the political needs of Germany. And that's a problem throughout Europe. The fact that you have these international cartels of investors coming in and buying control of companies. It works. It looks great when you're, worried about your 401k or whatever the European equivalent is, and the market and all this kind of stuff. But it doesn't work very well when you start to say, well, hey, Germany needs to go on a trajectory that's good for Germany, but all the things that you used to define Germany as, like German industry, no longer is responsive to Germany, but it's responsive to something different. And I think this is a pattern that's replicated in many other nations as well.
All right, before I snapped at Anne a little bit, sorry about that, darling, but she put on essentially the same question from our friend Sparky 3 times, verging on harassment. Look at this, Scott. 3 questions. We'll start with the first one. Scott, you're assuming that the American military is still rational. Scott, haven't you noticed the Pentagon is now populated with a bunch of incompetent cheese eaters? And Scott, why do you assume that the Biden administration is rational? Same question, basically 3 times. Anne thought this was important. So you want to address Sparky?
The U.S. military is rational. That's populated by professionals. And I mean, you can call them cheese eaters if you want. I don't understand. Most guys I know in the military eat steak, but they could eat cheese as well. Most people, we liked it when the ration pack included squeezed cheese, as long as the squeezed cheese wasn't stale. So I guess you could. I was a cheese eater when I was in the Marine Corps. But
I never knew that was a bad thing.
I think he's trying to say that they've turned into the French or something like that.
I see.
But no, they're rational. And even the Biden administration, you can't say they're irrational. That's just the key about solving problems is that you have to define the problem accurately. So if you are dismissive of the Biden administration, just saying they're irrational, you've not defined the problem. The Biden administration operates in a rational fashion in pursuit of its policy objectives. I happen to disagree with their policy objectives, but it's not irrational what they do. There's a rationality behind everything. I just think that it's misguided and it's pushing us in the wrong direction. But to call them, call everything, and to be dismissive, saying irrational, it means that you're not positioning yourself to better respond to the issues that you think are going in the direction you don't want them to go, because the solution you're going to come up with doesn't match the problem, so you're solving nothing. I just think that we need to be a little bit more careful with how easily we dismiss things because we disagree with them. Just because we disagree with them doesn't mean that they're irrational.
All right. I'll turn it over to you now, Ann. Let's get some questions in there from our beloved audience. Valley, one of our favorites, a regular for sure. I'd dearly love to know your take on the insufferable know-it-all Greta and why they give her the biggest mic.
How dare you?
Because we live in a PC world, and we have institutions like CNN and MSNBC and the mainstream media that has the ability to elevate somebody to a certain, to prominence, to give whatever they're saying. And Greta hit the trifecta. I mean, she came in, she got the platform. There's a great PR campaign by her parents and her supporters to promote her as something at a time when the U.S. government was pursuing climate change policies, and Greta was seen as a vehicle in which the climate change agenda could be promoted. And so she was elevated to all of this, and she was given the microphone, and they blare it out. And as long as climate change policy is has the prominence that it has, people like Greta will continue to get the microphone.
How dare you?
Can't believe that you spoke bad of darling Greta.
I didn't speak bad of darling Greta.
No, I guess you didn't. I guess you didn't. You're right. You're right. You didn't. And look, she's known by just one name. How many people achieve that in life, right? She's up there with Cher. Yeah, Cher.
Scott. Well, no, not quite.
Great Scott.
That's two.
Bill Swartz, did you see any protesters in Russia? Some news outlets said 10,000 or more were protesting in Moscow. Is that true?
But when? Some news outlets said 10,000 or more were protesting in Moscow. When? We know that early on in the conflict, there were protests, or widespread protests. Like the protesters left. Okay, they fled. Between 200,000, 400,000, maybe up to 1 million people fled Russia. They ran away. The people that are left in Russia aren't anti-war protesters. That doesn't mean that they approve of everything the government's doing, but they're Russian patriots. And I just put a marker on the table there, because how the Russians feel, and frankly speaking, how I feel, if Russia's in an existential conflict with the collective West, and that means a conflict for its very survival, a conflict that has assumed Russophobic proportions, where Russian national identity is being attacked, Russian culture, Russian language, Russian history, and you flee, you're the most anti-Russian person I can imagine. You're a coward. You've betrayed your country. You're despicable. You're disgusting. And that's it. But the Russians let him go, because that's like letting the weakness out of your body. But the Russians that remain, they're not in the business of protesting in the street. They're in the business of making Russia better. There's a lot of people right now that aren't happy about what's going on in this conflict. There's, I think, the more the West supports Ukraine, the more we empower this crazy terrorist named Zelensky and his government, the more the Russian people recognize that they're on the right side of history, and that this has to be defeated. I mean, that there is unanimous, overwhelming support for a victorious conclusion to this conflict, not because they agree why they went in to begin with, although, again, that's becoming more and more clear. It's becoming clearer now, the more Merkel, Hollande, Poroshenko talk about how Minsk was being used as a sham. Russians realize now that Putin had no choice. I think when Putin first went in, a lot of Russians were like, couldn't you have done something else? Did you really have to do this? We're not too happy about this this whole invading Ukraine kind of thing. But today, I think that debate's over. It's done. There's no one debating it. And they're not debating the reason why they went to war, and they're not debating what outcome they want. There's overwhelming support. I mean, Mr. Schwartz just said it was recent. I'll have to look at it. 10,000 is a lot in the streets. Moscow. I didn't see it when I was there. I can tell you that much. And to be honest, I'd be surprised if there were 10,000 people demonstrating in the streets of Moscow because of the current political or security environment. Putin put the quash on the Immortal Regiment demonstration because you don't want to create a potential target. So I have a hard time trying to visualize how a 10,000 person demonstration, how would they get the permits? But I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm saying I haven't seen it. I'll have to do the research. But I'm also surprised if there were 10,000 people just demonstrating against the war in Moscow. Why haven't I seen it on CNN? That seems to be something that CNN would like to run with, or MSNBC or something. But I've been traveling the last couple of days, so I haven't seen that. But I don't see the anti-war sentiment that you're talking about. I see just the opposite. I see a nation unified behind its leadership, unified behind the goals and objectives in this conflict. That doesn't mean that they're totally happy with what's going on. The one thing I heard over and over and over again in Russia is, I support my president. I have some questions. Okay, people who have questions mean that there's some things happening that they don't they don't understand. They want to know more. But they're not going to let that get in the way of the president leading the nation to victory. And that's their goal, and that's their objective right now. Once this war is over, once the situation has calmed down, I think there's going to be a lot of people going back and saying, all right, now, let's talk about the corruption that took place in a military district here. Why, when I sent my husband off to war, did he have to sit there for 4 weeks before he got a uniform? And when he did this, why? Because that's a fair question, but it's not a question that people are going to put first and foremost, because they need Russia to win the war right now. They don't need to sit there and pick on things. But there's a lot of questions out there. Why is there a village in Crimea that's 500 meters away from a major gas line, but the Russian bureaucracy won't let them have access to gas, so they continue to have to heat their house using electricity that costs them 12 times as much as the gas does in a depressed economy? Why would she do that? Why would they do that? Why, again, the same village, why would you not have canalizations